Hello, I'm Joanna North. I'm a psychotherapist and psychologist. Welcome to my Kind podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about how racism affects a child's mental health and affects families and adults too. And I'm going to be talking to Sheetal Amin, who is a colleague who works in CAMS. Now, you'll hear the expression CAMS in this podcast. It refers to child and adolescent mental health services. And Sheetal has got lots of experience in working with children and young people of many different cultures. So I think we were going to start with meeting of two worlds. So I would let you start with you as a professional coming into this conversation. I mean, what's your world?
Well, I guess, in terms of a professional coming into this conversation, as a psychotherapist, 1, 2 as a woman, 3 as an Indian woman, 4 as an Indian bilingual practitioner. So in terms of all of these differences, meeting another world in a therapy room, or whether that's a therapy room, whether that's in the community, the kind of work we do, what does that mean, and what needs to be considered? And I think often people feel that somehow the fear of offending gets in the way, or the unknown. Because I don't want to seem like I don't understand or I don't know, I won't ask the question. And often it's the most obvious. So what's in the subjective field? Like me and you, we're here together, Joe, but though yes, we're two women, we're two very different women in all its senses, Here we are together talking about what is psychotherapy, what does that mean for you, what does psychotherapy mean for me, and what is it that is okay to talk about, and when does it feel not okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Where does discrimination beginning and end? I think, because I, for example, I know perhaps in Devon, where I live, it's not so diverse, and yet I may meet an awful lot of children and young people, and I think at the moment we're focusing on children and young people who are outsiders and who are probably discriminated against because perhaps they're children in care, perhaps they're children who are adopted. They certainly feel different. And that's not the same as racial discrimination that really I think we're trying to focus on. And I think the big thing is finding a road into that conversation, as you say, that being afraid of, asking the wrong questions or raising issues that aren't helpful. I don't know if this is helpful, but I've been reading Eugene Ellis's book on the race conversation. And he talks about race being a social construct.
Yeah.
He says, look, biologically we're so much the same, but there's that we're all different in so many respects. From our origins of where we come from, or what colour is our skin, or what colour is our eyes or our hair. And that really got me thinking. The idea of race is being a social construct, and I'll be going on a bit, and I'll stop in a minute. But what it got me thinking was, as a white woman, and a white woman perhaps of an older generation, the stories about that construct in my life and how it's affected my thinking. I would say even my levels of insanity at times, I think I can safely say. And I kind of want to say that without sounding like I'm the victim of racism here, because I know that as a white woman I'm probably not. So I wonder how it would be if we had some time on our stories, and I'd love to know yours.
Well, it got me thinking, Joe, when you were talking about the social construct, and as Eugene was saying, and before that, sort of some of from the very beginning, Dexter Dias's work is about that nearly 98 up to something like that % that genetic code is the same of all human beings. So where did this idea of difference come in? Where was it that suddenly, if you had blue eyes, that you were more superior. You know, if you had blonde hair,
Yeah.
blue-eyed, what does that mean compared to if you had brown hair and brown eyes, or brown hair and, you know, well, brown eyes and black hair? You know, what was minority and what was not okay and what was okay and what was superior? And it takes me all the way back. And I was just thinking, as you were saying that, you know, thinking as a white woman, you know, your experience of racism, or whether you're victim or not, and you're not in that position. And in my head, I was having this conversation that I wonder whether it would be the same sort of if you were a white woman in India. And then I thought again of like, gosh, it took me back to colonization and colonial India, which is, you know, for me, that's part of my narrative. The other part of my narrative is then, you know, Asians from East Africa. So I've come from two different worlds where the kind of the government, or the, you know, in India, it was very much that colonialism, which drove India until Gandhi kind of, you know, got independence. So I'm part of that history. And then East Africa, I'm part of a history where Idi Amin in the 70s very much had this coup and was almost kind of wiping East Africa clean. And so many were killed and so many had to flee the country very quickly. And my parents were part of that narrative, who had to flee the country, who had to leave for their safety and the safety of their children. So, you know, on some levels, yes, they were refugees, or they were seeking asylum. They got asylum, and their saving grace would have been that, I guess, part of their narrative is they've always had a British passport. So because they've always had a British passport, they're able to be in the UK and feel safe, and were able to work in the UK, which is often the barrier for so many who are trying to flee their country and make something of themselves and their family in another country.
Absolutely.
The idea of displacement. So, you know, I was just thinking the levels of it, that, you know, how does I was thinking about sort of going back to even my psychotherapy training, and when we talk about difference and how some people would comment that, well, I don't see you, I don't mean you, sort of those kind of flippant, but it's not, I don't mean you, or I don't see you any different, you know, we're all the same. So we're coming from this place of sameness, which is not okay. You know, what's wrong with being able to say, actually, what's your experience, because clearly it's different to mine.
Absolutely. So to sort of say, oh, I don't notice your color is really a bit erasing, isn't it? It's just like, oh, hang on, you know, that don't do that to me. It's not, it doesn't feel quite right, does it? So did you get born in East Africa, or were you born in the UK?
So I was born in East Africa. So I was born in sort of, you know, by my birthright, I'm Kenyan. So I was born, and at that point, I guess the influence for me was the native language, which was Swahili. So I would have understood that, and I lived there, I think, until sort of 5, and then I was moved. So when there was the coup by Idi Amin in the 70s, my parents, because they had I have 2 younger siblings, they came over to the UK, but mum couldn't be a working mother, nor could dad, and also managed 3 kids. And it's very, very usual in Indian families, in Asian families, whereby children are raised as part of an extended system. So I was sent to my maternal grandparents to be raised.
Right.
And then I kind of...
Africa?
In India.
Oh, okay, blimey.
So my parents and my 2 younger siblings came to UK. Whilst I was sent, because I was slightly older, I was 5. There's 3 years between me and my sister, and there's 5 years between me and my brother. So they were very little, and they were very dependent on our mother. So they came to UK, and I went to India to be raised.
Can I just ask you, when you say you were sent, what do you mean? You didn't go on your own, did you?
No, so I think she took me. She would have dropped me there, but it felt like I was sent off, you know.
Packaged up in a parcel to grandma.
Yeah, it feels a bit like that. It's a bit like that kind of Saint Christopher story, and we have some of those in the Indian culture of like Lord Krishna being put in this basket, and even though he was given birth to by one mother, he was raised by another mother, and there's a huge kind of cultural story about who his real mother is and what does mother mean.
Yeah,
because he was raised by one, but he was birthed by another, and it feels a bit like that, like I was parceled up and kind of put to somebody else and kind of left there whilst they continued in the UK.
So how long did you spend there then?
6 years. So I came here when I was about 11, 12.
Wow.
So I came straight into secondary school, and it would have been in the second or third term of secondary school.
Wow.
So I didn't even join right at the beginning of term. So again, all of those transitions. I had never seen a white person before I came to the UK.
Oh my goodness. So
or snow or cold.
Yeah. So where was that school then?
So the secondary school was in East Sussex. So I'm a Brighton girl. I'm a southern girl.
Yeah.
So it's a small town outside of East Sussex, going outside of Brighton. So it's going more towards New Haven, more towards the docks, that end of East Sussex.
Yeah.
So I'm from a small town there.
Wow.
And my dad was the local GP in the village.
Wow.
So everybody knew him. And by default, then everybody would know everything I got up to.
Yeah.
So,
Goodness. So that is a massive story of change. So between 5 and 11, did you see your parents?
No, not at all. All my siblings. Between 5 and 12, I didn't see my parents. I didn't see my siblings.
Oh, that is a massive story of change, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have similar stories of change, you and I. Interestingly, I mean, I had a bit of a life like that. But I have to tell you that so when I was 16 at secondary school, one of my teachers, I think it was the environmental sciences teacher, said, let's all get in the minibus after school and go and welcome the refugees from East Africa who have been expelled by Idi Amin. So that was a kind of memory of that. So we took clothes and toys and sweets and things, and these poor people kind of looking dazed in a camp, and with a bunch of 16-year-olds. I don't know how helpful we were, but it's kind of a memory that I have, of that time. That was big in the news, the expulsion of all of these Indian people. I was raised in a family who were racist. There's no other way to describe it. I can't make the words better, so I have to use the words. They were just attitudes of superiority to other races. And I think my family probably would have thought that they were perfectly decent in their attitudes. They weren't cruel and they weren't unkind people, but they were just like, race doesn't come near us. But having said that, we moved to Africa. And so when I was about 11, we moved out to Zambia, which was an independent black country, which was a fascinating experience. And so I went to a school where there was a big mixture of black girls, white girls, and Asian girls, because there are a lot of Asian people in Zambia. Mm-hmm. But the point is this, I mean, I went through a lot of change like you, but the point is, Eugene says in his book, it's so confusing. It's sort of like, I definitely absorbed that attitude. It soaked into me. It's just like, we don't mix with people from other races, and I find myself having to apologize, but it's what I was soaked in. And I remember when we came back from Africa, we went twice. We also lived in Zimbabwe, which was when it was Rhodesia, and it was obviously, completely racist. When we came back, and I was at college, there was a really nice boy who really loved me, and he was Asian. He was from Sri Lanka, actually. And I chatted to him at college. I used to chat to him, and I used to think he's such a nice guy. One day he turned up at my house to say hi. And I had to say to him, I completely panicked. And I had to say, I'm really sorry. I have to send you away. My dad really won't like you being here. And in doing that, it breaks my heart to tell you this story, but I have to tell you that was what I was raised with. In doing that, I was trying to stop my dad being mean to him, and I was trying to stop my dad absolutely being mean to me because I was friends with an Asian guy. And that tension there that I describe, that fear, is kind of like stuck. And it's the confusion, as Eugene says in his book, that racial construct confuses people. And I for many, many years held a confusion in my mind about how the heck do I do this? So I take no pride in telling you this, but I have to tell you the truth of what my experience was. So we were raised at a time when kind of people laughed at programs about a black family that moved next door to a white family. I can't even remember what it was called now, but it was, it was like really a popular program. And that was the water in which we swam. I suppose coming out, I wouldn't dare to say that I've left that behind. I certainly think very, very hard about racial constructs. And I certainly feel that from a white person's point of view, raised in that era, that racial construct was harmful. It was harmful to my psyche in that I couldn't laugh or be friends with people around me that I loved. And I suppose that summarizes, my psychological state around that. When I was much older, I did a year of diversity training, working with a Nigerian company who did fantastic trainings. I felt so privileged to be let in. But I did a year going around the employment service doing diversity training. I nearly killed myself. In fact, I made myself ill doing it. I did so many of them. And it was me kind of punishing myself almost for trying to put that right, So, I won't say more, but I couldn't possibly have this conversation about race, Sheetal, without being absolutely truthful about being immersed in that construct,
I think this is the thing, isn't it? How do we talk? How do parents talk to their children about racism? How do teachers talk to children about racial trauma? How far does it go? And unless we start looking at our own narrative, and though, like you say, there was a time and place where that seemed to be the norm. And why was it the norm? It's like, it's really important to question what that's done to our psyche and what's been embedded. And I don't think, as you were talking, Joe, I was thinking, actually, the narratives are similar and dissimilar. And I was reflecting on the idea of how my dad was. If I were to bring on somebody who was not Indian, what that would mean, but also coming as an Indian girl to bring home a boy. So not only did I have that bit, but if I brought home a boy that wasn't Indian, or if I thought about marrying or being with a boy that was, white, black, but who was non-Indian and not of the same kind of caste system, because then there's the other layer of that. It's talked about in terms of, well, it's not the done thing in our culture. It's not part of our religion. It's not part of our culture. But actually, nobody ever talks about it. Or that my uncles, aunties, or my dad, or my, those families don't talk about it in terms of that's racism. Where is it about sort of, we've gone those layers. So we've got the layer of it's not the right caste to marry into. So it's not the right pedigree to be with for you. Then we have another layer of it's not the right kind of Indian for you. Then we have another layer, well, it's not the right color for you.
Yeah.
And then I think about, how far do the issues of color go? And difference go? And sort of, I'm reminded, Joe, of sort of growing up and as an Indian girl, the amount of pressure that's on Indian girls to be light-skinned.
Wow, yeah.
To be fair, because there is still, and those kind of very I guess old concepts are still there. You know, those kind of very, very orthodox concepts are still there around the fairer you are, the sooner you're going to find the right kind of breed of a male to marry and the right kind of family to marry into.
Right.
The darker you are, you're going to be left on the shelf. Alongside that is that, you know, you've got all of these criteria to meet. One, fair-skinned. Two, to be slim, you know, not be big boned, be petite. You know, to have lighter hair, not to have dark hair, to have lighter eyes, not dark eyes, you know, to have all of these kind of sharp features, don't have plumpy faces, you know. So you've got all of these kind of criteria for an Indian girl to be able to kind of go through in order to find the right pedigree.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way, I think we're capturing between us something about we're going to look at whether things are better or worse. We're going to make a sort of evaluation of good and bad and you know, race is one of them for sure, but then we're going to do one on thin and fat and light and dark and it's just like somehow in our brains we seem to want to, and I think this is everybody's brain. I don't want to generalize and I don't want to psychologicalize racism because I think that's a mistake, but sort of our brains want to do better than or worse than. You know, better than or worse than, and actually that's pretty, you know what, I'd expect a 5-year-old, I mean actually I've got a 5-year-old grandson and he does that, he's deciding who's better than me, who's worse than me, you know, because that's his brain development, and it's a pretty primitive way for us to behave, isn't it, you know.
Very polarized as well, isn't there, you know, in terms of what remains in the shadows, and it's, you know, it's either black or white. There's you can, you know, there's yin or yang, you know, so it's these polarized positions that we all take. Why do we take them? Where do those influences come from to take those polarized positions? And, you know, how often do we question our own, what's kind of been influencing our own psyches in terms of that? And yet again, it's that round circle back to what is a social construct. Where did it come from? You know, the Aryan race, the idea of the Aryan race and what that meant, and the superior race, that, you know, if you've got to be, and I mean, I guess, you know, it's interesting, I'm reflecting on sort of the two countries before coming to the UK that I was sort of, that's part of my psyche, both colonized countries. You know, East Africa was colonial East Africa, India was colonial India by the British rule at the time. You know, they were under the Queen. So I've come from both of those countries where that's how it was. And the idea of what superior was very clear to me. You know, in East Africa, it was, you know, white on one side, Indians there. If you're black, you're there.
You
know,
no, absolutely.
You know, and you might relate to that in terms of possibly some of your experience of Zambia.
I totally, it's the first picture that comes into my head when I think of Zambia. At school, there's 3 groupings. There was black, there was white, and there was Asian. And it's just like, I never kind of, I was probably, you know, too preoccupied with surviving to question how is it to be Asian in this, because you're kind of, I forgive the terminology, but I can only think in how it was then, but it was kind of like Asian was kind of in the middle. That's a terrible thing to think, but certainly instead of that sort of, and do you know, I remember this beautiful memory, at that school we did an end of term performance, and one of the Asian girls did the most beautiful dance in her Asian, she didn't have a sari, but she had the trousers and a top, and she did this beautiful Indian dance with singing, and it sticks in my heart because that was kind of all that mattered. That was the only memory that mattered, really, that she showed us who she, and she was absolutely fabulous, you know. And I actually think that kind of might bring us on. I mean, you and I could talk for a long time, and I think this is a very worthy conversation, and we've clearly both got a lot more to say as women on this subject. But I just wonder if we were to address the issue of inoculating children against racism, and somehow that picture means a lot of this Indian girl in this sort of boiling pot of cultures doing her dance and being really proud of it, you know. And I wonder if that is a kind of symbol of inoculation for children. I don't know whether you're ready to sort of start to think about that for the rest of this. We've got about 10 minutes to go.
It's powerful, isn't it, Jo, in terms of how do we inoculate our children?
Yeah.
And I'm just reflecting on sort of me as a parent. What's important to me is the idea of integration. Yeah. And how that's at the core of my family values here. You know, which is about that collaboration, which is more about inclusion rather than exclusion. You know, making sure my children have been exposed to the world around them as much as possible. Yeah. How do I look at that? How do I celebrate differences? How do I integrate them into celebrating difference with me? Yeah. You know, how do I take them and get them to understand different festivals and different religions and different cultures, different foods? We're talking about very, very young children. Where do you start? And that inoculation is almost at the level of sense before language sits in, doesn't it? It's those senses. How do we inoculate with our senses? Yeah. How do we inoculate with what we can see, what we can smell, what we can taste, what we can hear? How do we inoculate with what we can feel? Yeah, yeah. You know? That's and how do we celebrate that? And it's about that awareness that children need. You know, the more you kind of, you know, the more they hear a negative narrative, and the more they're exposed to negative narrative, as we're saying, that becomes part of the psyche. And how do they become aware of it? So how can we talk about these things like we are?
Well, absolutely. Don't you think that in schools there, you know, that is the boiling pot of this wonderful difference? And sometimes I imagine myself being a teacher. You know, it says a lot about my imagination. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not a teacher, but sometimes I imagine the power that a teacher has to bring that all together. Yeah. That the power that they have to say, oh, we really hope that this little boy is really proud of being from Pakistan, and we really hope that this little girl is really proud of being from Sri Lanka, and this little girl is really proud of having red hair. And you know, that I just, I know teachers feel that a lot gets put on them, but they are the point of integration to me. I think there is a lot that schools do, but in my opinion, there's a lot more that we could do. Yeah. I don't know, you must see that in your work with CAMS.
There is, you know, it's what I hear from young people within CAMS when we talk about racial trauma and racial justice, the kind of trigger for young people to feel they had permission to talk about their experiences when the horrible tragedy of George Floyd came about. I remember the conversations the adolescents felt liberated to have about race. You know, for the first time, you had so many young people who actually went on protest. For the first time, they felt that they could have a voice and talk about what's not okay, their experiences of being made to feel different. You know, how we start to look at our own prejudged assumptions. How do we look at our prejudice? You know, how do we look at our own internalized racism and racial opinions?
Absolutely. It's really a worthy exercise, isn't it, of introspection. But you know what? Don't you think we need encouraging to do that? I mean, this conversation encourages me to, I don't think I've ever really said to people, I would have said it to my husband, I would have said it to very few very close friends, hey, do you know what, my family were real, they came out with the racist stuff I couldn't even repeat. I couldn't, and they thought they were really good people. You know, to have that level of, that's only the start of a conversation. Believe me, that doesn't solve my problems about being raised in that culture, believe me. So it's great. I mean, there's so many ways that we can start these conversations, and I actually feel that this is a great start. I just want to tell you that story of that lovely young man who had turned up at my door to say hi. who I absolutely said, let's walk down the road together, so I could just get him out of the way, you know, so that he didn't get shot and I didn't get shot. I wrote a novel about that. I've written a story about it, and in the story I kind of had to have a relationship with that person. And I think it affected my psyche so much, that taboo and that fear. I had to, the only way I could resolve it was in my imagination.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'd love to share that story sometime, but that's not the point. I just think that people just need permission, like you say, to start talking, to share their concerns. And actually, you know what starts to happen, it seems to me, in these conversations, that people just find, oh, for goodness sake, we're all walking around judging one another, why don't we just, you know. And it's not as simple as that, I know, because there is an endemic systemic racism with which we live in our world, without question, that needs a lot of attention. So it's not as simple as conversations. But when we start conversations, we just start to feel we're more the same than we're different. Do you think that's possible?
I think for me, it's the reverse almost, Jo. It's about starting those conversations about making it okay to be different.
Okay.
And making it okay to talk about the difference. So, you know, if we were talking about schools, and I was just thinking about, you know, my experience of secondary school in a very, very white village.
Oh my goodness.
And a massive, and I was the only person of colour in the whole secondary school. And the racism I suffered was phenomenal. The attacks, both physical and verbal, were phenomenal.
Yeah.
And, you know, to have a head of the school say to my parents, I mean, we're going back to the 80s. So we're talking about mid-80s, when attitudes around racism were very different. And we had a head of the secondary school said to my parents, she'll just have to learn to ignore it, because I cannot expel or suspend or do anything with the whole school. She'll have to learn to ignore it. And that was it.
Well, God knows what that must have done to you and your psyche and your mental health. And you know what's really interesting about that is your dad was in a relative position of power, wasn't he?
But he's also a male who comes from a culture, an Indian culture, which is actually, as a culture and as a race, not as a culture, as a race, it's quite a passive race. Not a kind of race that is often seen as being confrontational. The part of India he's from, it's not associated with confrontational, though there are lots of in the archetype, of course, in terms of religions and all of that, there's dynamics, but he comes from a place of complacency, not about confrontation. So he wasn't able to. He said, well, you just have to do what the head says. What can we do? What can we do? You'll have to learn to ignore it.
What was what did you find that got you through? I mean, did you take their ridiculous advice?
I will tell you what got me through. My saving grace was, and as the universe, Jung says the universe always provides, and the universe did provide, which is that 3 girls joined school. And those 3 girls from a traveling community. So they knew what it was like to be different. But they were 3 girls who were not scared of challenging, being confrontational. And there was 3 of them. They were sibling grouped together. And they took me in. So I had a place to belong. I wasn't on my own anymore. I wasn't isolated. I wasn't left out to feel like I'm completely diseased in some way. Because I felt like that, it was very much like you are the alien, you are the one that's diseased, you're the one that smells, you're the one who can't speak properly, you're the one academically don't know whether we have any interest in it, you're that thing there. And to suddenly have these 3 girls who joined the sibling group from a traveling community, who knew the kind of law of the land, and they moved around quite a bit, so they knew what to expect whenever they went into a school. And that's what saved me, Jo.
Wow.
Something about validation of my experiences and empathy at such a deep level that I wasn't alone.
Did you become their friends, or what, did you just observe them and I became
their friend, and they became my closest friends. all
Wow.
throughout my secondary school. We were, you know, they absolutely, I was joined at the hip with them.
Wow. Do you still know them?
Sadly not, because I think, you know, they've kind of separated out, and I've left that part of East Sussex.
Yeah.
So I did before I moved, and my early days when I first got married, I bumped into one of them and said to them, you know, why don't you come to London, come see me, let's meet up. And she's like, oh no, that's too big.
Yeah.
I'm happy with my little town here, but I'm not coming to London.
Oh,
you know.
bless. Oh, that's a good story. Okay, so maybe we're saying, I mean, we got to wind up in a few minutes, so it's like hard to find a place of what to wind up, but I think we're saying that you found resilience in people that would take you in and make you feel like that little group made you feel like you belonged. And even though there was a ridiculous, huge community saying, oh, get over it, you know, get used to it, which is insane. I mean, it's enough. I'm surprised you survived, but that group of girls who knew about difference and they knew about rejection, they accepted you and you survived. And I guess that tells us something about what makes children survive, doesn't it? It's just like
belonging. It's being able to have a space and a place where you can have a voice. It's why I think it's so important to have subgroups within schools, university, colleges around EDI, you know, equality, diversity, inclusivity, which are young people forums where they can talk about issues around difference, where they can have those conversations with people, where they can go, this happened, and the other person goes, yeah, I know what you mean, this is what happened for me. And that's just as important, because if they feel like they can't do that in a collective way, how can they do it in other forums? But I think baseline is that we need to be enabling young people and children to have a voice, give the permission, build the resilience, expose them to experiences so that they know and don't feel that it's taboo. Because racism also comes from a place of feeling something has to be feared and has to be that I feel a threat. So then I'm going to go into fight, flight, or fright.
Exactly. That's the big one. And I think our next conversation, perhaps we could talk more about that, because I think on this subject it's quite clear we need to make 2 podcasts. I'm going to stop recording there. Thank you for listening. We will continue to discuss this and other topics related to child mental health. So make sure you subscribe, and if you have any questions for future episodes, please email me. There is a link in the podcast description.